Your seats. The council's called back to order. Members, if you'd be good enough to turn to the agenda item number 10. Agenda item number 10, report from the Delta Independent Science Board. Dr. Collier, good to see you here today, sir.
So am I now on?
You are now on.
That's marvelous. So this is a report from the Science Board, your Science Board. We have had a couple of meetings since the last time I talked to you. I think what I want to do is, you have the report of the, primarily it constitutes our comments on the first and second draft of the science plan.
Right.
At the end of that report, it also says that we discussed at our meeting just a couple of weeks ago the BDCP and our charge to review that. Since we just finished BDCP prior to this item on the agenda, I thought I'd just briefly cover that where we are.
Good idea.
We were planning to have an in-person meeting towards the end of October where we would throw ourselves into the BDCP, but now with the public draft coming out in mid-November, we will probably end up, it's not for sure yet, we'll probably end up making that a teleconference rather than an in-person meeting.
Right.
And we also are aware of the 120-day comment period and also the need, to the extent we can, to coordinate with the council as you provide comments on BDCP. So from our science perspective, it's a rather compressed schedule for something that large and technically detailed, but I've been discussing with some members of the ISB, we will do our best to make comments. It'll probably be fairly high-level comments, but we'll try to make them in a time frame that allows us to coordinate with you and have a nice, hopefully cohesive response to BDCP coming from.
Well, it's pretty clear from Carla Nema's comments that they're very aware of your
Yes.
comments on the earlier releases of BDCP and are going to try to address some of them, which is good.
And we'll definitely be looking for those.
Yeah, right.
And again, we have put in a request previously for a red line version showing where the changes were made or something to show how.
Have you heard of
I myself am not aware if that is going to occur.
Just a suggestion, Chris or Peter, just to follow up with BDCP saying, look, the Science Board requested a red line. Is there any possibility of getting it done? By when? Because it makes it much easier to review because
right.
Now, I don't know what the possibility is. We were unable to produce our red line until something like the next to last version, and it was always a gigantic management problem. So,
all right.
Okay.
So the main thing I want to talk about is the lead up to the discussion that's coming after this of the Delta Science Plan. Mm-hmm. We provided, and I talked to you about it the last time I was here, gave you a brief overview of our comments on the first version. Those are now finalized and are included in your package. I don't want to spend time on those other than to say in our comments on the second draft of the Delta Science Plan.
This is a September 16th.
September 16th, so just a week ago. We felt that, in fact, the science program had done a really admirable job of hearing, reading, and understanding our comments and responding to them in what we thought was a constructive and productive way. So that's the lead off is that, again, as we talked about the last time I came to a DSC meeting, we did feel that the first draft of the Delta Science Plan was a very positive step. We feel the second draft responded to a lot of our concerns. We still, of course, have some further comments, and probably the primary one is that we still are recommending to the Delta Science Program that they should strive higher. They should have a higher bar for trying to have some overall coordination of science activities in the Delta, even though we realize, and as they would ask us in discussions, give us an example of what you mean. We were having trouble coming up with those examples other than to say, please do better. That's not a really helpful suggestion. But we did feel that this is a time when there is this window of opportunity to maybe make a major change in how things are done and organized in the Delta. So that's in our second comments, a series of areas where we say you could do better or you could take advantage of some of these occurrences. One of the issues was that we thought there really needs to be a preamble to the science plan explaining this special situation that we find ourselves in, explaining things like our environmental approach, our regulatory approach to environmental protection of the past has really been about maintaining the status quo. It's been about not having further degradation. Well, we're now in a situation where the status quo is not acceptable. We have to improve on the current situation. In order to do that, is it in fact the case that our regulatory, our management structure is not set up to do other than preserve where we are rather than making progress? And we had a lot of discussion about permitting and streamlining and the difficulty in all these projects that it has when you have to go through so many permitting steps in order to get anything done. And that was meant to slow projects down from degrading, but when our projects being proposed now are meant to be improving conditions, and we have to jump through those same hoops. And that's not technically a pure science issue, obviously, but it's one that we expressed it should be considered and spoken to probably by the Delta Council. Another change in the second draft compared to the first draft was the inclusion of a science steering committee. We felt that this science steering committee was a positive step in that it was meant to be a group of 12 scientists selected from the region by the lead scientist, but not selected from a variety of entities, including the regulated entities as well as regulatory and other representatives. They're not to be partisan on the science steering committee, but we recommend that the science program consider ways to make this science steering committee vest a little more authority in it so that it actually can affect the course of science and not be just giving recommendations that people don't have to listen to. One of those areas that we thought was potentially very, where this could happen would be in the creation of the science action agenda, which is a list of the high priority items that need to be done, science activities that need to be conducted in the Delta, that this science steering committee could potentially, and this is not as much, this is more in subsequent discussions with the program, so one potential would be that science steering committee could actually help to prioritize that list of priorities. So rather than a list of priorities, you have a prioritized list of actions. And that then could be something that the different agencies conducting science could be held to in saying, are you in fact conducting science that is the highest priority in the region? So in here in our comments, we talk about whether the science steering committee could have funding authority, et cetera. In general, our overall message is that the science steering committee could be vested with more authority in hopes of having a little more of I don't want to say top down, but a little more of a
focus.
Focus and an authority to get things done within the science community. We also recommended that there needs to be more emphasis on scientific synthesis. It keeps being said that this is one of the primary needs. We felt that could be sharpened. That the modeling section, again, modeling is paramount, and having a variety of models that people can discuss and look at the outputs is paramount. Even though Randy keeps saying, can't we just have one model, please? It really does take a variety of modelers and modeling approaches, much as you replicate anything else in science. So that's a discussion for later over a beer, perhaps. But that's probably the largest part of the major emphasis in our comments on the second draft is to raise the bar, take advantage of the opportunity and time that we have now to make more of a difference in how science is conducted. And then I think item 4, I don't want to go through all these in detail. You've got them written out for you,
right.
And that's just a lot of time to go through the words that are already written. Item 4 on funding not being adequately considered in both the first and second draft of the Delta Science Plan. The section on funding and how this enterprise will be funded is basically deferred to the next draft. At this point, that funding description then, as I understand it, and I don't think this is quite set, and it's probably up to the council, that funding description could potentially be written up and not subject to much review before a final draft. The feeling on the part of the science board was that there should be some opportunity for a review of a funding description, or that funding description could be written up in more detail at some later date, but still subject to some review. And then you have a bunch of individual comments from the ISB members. Those are all, again, that's just what individual people said, and those are useful for the science program to consider. Some of them probably are contradictory. I wouldn't be surprised. But I think
Do you mean different opinions from scientists?
Well, some people on the board were wrong, is what I mean to say. So that's up to the science program to sort out. And I think, yeah. So when we get then to BDCP, as I said, we're going to try to get that done as efficaciously as possible. I'm hoping that Dick Norgard, currently the past chair of the board, who took on BDCP as sort of his charge, and then ended up not being the chair by the time we're getting it. I'm encouraging him to keep that as his charge. So I'm hoping to.
Could he, in any conceivable way, consider that a hostile suggestion?
He doesn't usually say much when I mention that during the meeting. So anyway, so I think if at this point, do you have questions on the report that you've got or anything else? And I think the intent is really to get into the discussion of the Delta Science Plan.
Mr. Knopphead.
Dr. Collier, you made a comment that it's no longer reasonable, I guess it was, to maintain the status quo. When you were talking about the status quo, were you referring to listed species or something broader?
So that was a general discussion that we had that in general, we're dealing now with degraded systems. We passed a lot of legislation in the 70s, at least at the national level. I'm not that familiar with what the legislation has gone on in California, but at the national level, we passed legislation, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, that were meant to stop any further degradation. Well, it obviously hasn't stopped. More and more species are listed. We're now trying to recover them. We're trying to restore habitats. But we still have this, so the status quo, we're trying to change the status quo and to improve conditions broadly across many regions of the country, across species outcomes, across habitat structure. So our regulatory process, though, is really aimed at making sure that we do very exhaustive analysis of any action in such a way that we make sure that we're not going to cause further harm. It slows things down while people consider that. There's a reason that the laws were written that way, and I'm going a little off message here, so don't necessarily assume that this is the ISB speaking to you. This is me just sitting here on camera having fun. So
having fun. Let me write that down.
They told me I could on this job. So now, though, as we try to improve, and we want to, especially in science, as we want to undertake environmental experimentation, and we want to try something that we're not sure how it's going to turn out. We may try some novel restoration practice. Unfortunately, it is taking place in the real world where these endangered species are, and therefore the same exact requirements for doing all of these extensive analyses are in existence, and it really slows down the ability to conduct experiments. And yet Chairman Eisenberg, is saying, I need an answer and I need it soon. Well, it takes us 2 years to get a permit, us collectively, 2 years to get a permit to even begin to undertake an action that's going to take us several years more to understand if it was effective. So he gets really frustrated with that. So we think he should fix that. We think he should fix that.
Well, one follow-up question on that is, are you suggesting to the science plan that they undertake a monitoring program to have the ability to determine the status quo?
Peter, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think that was in our comments on the science plan that monitoring, it's in our review of the habitat restoration science that we felt that monitoring, especially pre-project monitoring, is simply not getting the attention and the resourcing, especially, that it needs. That's just critical to any experiment that we do. So set aside the permitting issues. If we're going to conduct an experiment and we haven't determined the baseline before we start the experiment, that's not generally considered good science. So we do have to have better and more responsive monitoring prior to undertaking actions. But I don't recall, your question was if we recommended the science program. I don't think we have, Peter, have we? Not specifically. It is not in response to the science plan.
I know at the ISB meeting we had a lengthy discussion about the baseline and the need for a good baseline. And what gets my attention about your comment is I think it's part of the regulatory process as well, the determination of the status quo and whether it's holding steady or declining. And Jeff Mount's recent comments on the technical question of whether we can adopt the plan and the legal requirements associated with it bring this point up. And how can we adaptively manage if we don't understand what that baseline is, or whatever we're going to define as the status quo is, so that we can determine whether we're meeting our regulatory requirements or not. So that's where I was going with it.
That's obviously a legitimate point, that you have got to have that understanding of where you are now before you start. But in many cases, and again, I'm not speaking anymore as a federal fishery scientist. We do things that we don't understand where we're starting from, because we feel that there's a need to act very quickly. And we do act, and then we try to figure out what it meant later on. That's a fact of life. But another fact is we should be having more due diligence on pre-assessment prior to an action or prior to some experiment.
Thanks.
Any questions?
Let's do Delta Science Plan. Oh, shoot, here it goes.
Related to the Delta Science Plan, but also relating to the previous discussion on BDCP that you had here, the discussions that are going on in the BIOPS litigation seem to me to be the most advanced of all the governmental private parties discussions on a whole host of things that relate to the science plan and best available science and adaptive management. To what extent are you folks following that? There's some public reports on it and a lot of meetings.
So I myself have not been following. I know there's been the remand. I know the BIOPS. Obviously, I worked with BIOPS a lot up in the Northwest in my position with NOAA Fisheries. I know how critically important those are. I myself am not familiar with them. As a board, we're well aware that we have to take that into account. Some members of the board are much more well-versed in those. I should be, but I'm not. But I will be, I promise.
Okay.
But I agree that the BIOPS and the analysis that goes into those BIOPS, they are really detailed, and they have a tremendous
it's
amount
not
of
just the
information.
analysis, and Peter serves on one of the structures. I can't remember the acronyms on that, and Anka Muller-Solger is on another, and
Reiner and Lauren.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of staff's involved, but they're really advancing what'll be a test of a new governance and science structure in some fashion. And if it is a test that the agencies might wish to apply in BDCP, it seems to me pretty important for you guys to be there and add that into your consideration. And I know that's what Peter's doing on the whole thing. That would be helpful to us.
Okay, that's good to know.
Thank you. All right. Okay.
And certainly, Chair Eisenberg, that would fit very well with the next task which the ISB is taking on, the fish and flows.
Right.
So obviously that would be part of it.
Okay. Doctor, thank you very much.
Yep. I think I'm instructed to stay here for the discussion of the Delta Science Plan.
We
And
would
more
be
people will
we
join
would be honored and flattered.
But you can dismiss me if you like.
No. Well, if you want to be dismissed, I
well,
pretend I have the
we could
authority
have
to
that
do so.
discussion, yeah.
Stay where you are.
I'll stay.
No, I actually thought, because this is presumably going to be a free-flowing discussion. I don't know if Reiner and
Yeah, well,
Lauren
this
want to
flows
just
directly
set up
into
and then-
agenda item 11 on the science plan.